23-year-old Christina Morris has not been seen since August 30th when she walked into a garage at the shops at Legacy. Police say they have no new leads.
I'm trying to report a missing person, so my daughter, she hasn't shown up from work. I'm just finding out about this. Everybody's freaking out.
It's been 2 years since Christina Morris vanished from a Plano parking garage. She was caught on surveillance video. That was the last time she was seen. Plano police believe she was abducted and murdered.
It is the answer she wanted but prayed would never come. Today, Christina Morris's mother took flowers to the spot where her daughter's remains were found in Anna.
In the early morning hours of August 30th, 2014, a security camera inside a parking garage in Plano, Texas, captured something that would soon become evidence in one of the most disturbing disappearance cases in the state. A young woman walks into the parking garage. She had just spent the evening out with friends. Walking beside her is a man she knows. They move between the concrete pillars toward the area where their cars are parked. For a few moments, the two disappear from the camera's view. Then suddenly, only the man drives back out. The woman never appears again. 23-year-old Christina Morris had vanished. She had been last seen entering that garage after a night out with friends in the shops at Legacy district of Plano. No witnesses, no screams, no clear explanation. Just a few seconds of security footage that would launch one of the largest missing person investigations in North Texas. And at that moment, no one realized they were witnessing the beginning of a mystery that would haunt investigators for years. Before the investigation and headlines, there was simply Christina Morris. Christina was 23 years old. She lived in Plano, Texas, a city just north of Dallas, known for its quiet neighborhoods, office parks, and growing nightlife district. By day, Christina worked at a technology consulting firm. It was the kind of job many young professionals in the Dallas area were building their careers around. But outside of work, Christina was known for something else entirely: energy. Friends often described her as outgoing, talkative, and impossible to ignore in a room. She had a personality that made people feel comfortable almost immediately. The kind of friend who could start a conversation with anyone. And the kind of friend who rarely liked staying home on a weekend night. Christina loved being around people. After work, it wasn't unusual for her to meet up with friends in the shops at Legacy area of Plano, one of the most popular nightlife spots in North Texas. Restaurants, bars, music, and crowds of young professionals looking to unwind after the week. For Christina, those nights out were simply part of normal life. She also cared deeply about staying active. Fitness was a regular part of her routine. Friends remember her spending time at the gym, working out, and staying in shape. But the people closest to Christina say the most important relationship in her life was with her family, especially her mother. The two spoke frequently, often checking in with each other throughout the week. It was a close bond, one built on constant communication. And there was one small habit Christina had that her friends and family always noticed. Whenever she went out at night, she would send a message when she got home. Just a quick text, something simple. "Hey, I made it back." For the people who loved her, it was a routine they had come to expect, a small gesture that let everyone know she was safe. But on one night in late August 2014, that message never came. And when the hours began to pass without it, those who knew Christina best started to realize something was very wrong. That evening, she headed toward one of the busiest nightlife districts in North Texas, the shops at Legacy. Located in Plano, the area is known for its restaurants, bars, and crowded patios filled with young professionals winding down after the work week. For Christina and her friends, it was a familiar place, a place they had gone many times before. Friends later told investigators that Christina appeared completely normal that night. She was relaxed, happy, laughing and joking with the group. There were no signs that anything was wrong. At some point later in the evening, the group made their way to a popular bar in the area known as Social House. Inside, the atmosphere was loud and energetic. Music played. People moved between tables and the outdoor patio. It looked like any other busy Friday night, and for Christina, it was just another night out with friends. But somewhere in that crowd was someone who would soon become central to the investigation, a man named Enrique Orochi. Christina had known him for years. The two had attended the same high school in Allen, Texas. They were not strangers, which meant that seeing him that night likely didn't feel unusual at all. At the time, it was simply another familiar face in a crowded bar. No one in that room could have imagined that the night would soon turn into the final confirmed hours of Christina Morris's life. For Christina Morris and her friends, the night was coming to an end. Sometime around 3:30 in the morning on August 30th, 2014, Christina left the bar. Security cameras in the area would later help investigators piece together what happened next. One of those cameras captured Christina walking into a nearby parking garage. Walking beside her was someone investigators already knew she had seen that night, Enrique Orochi. The two appeared to be walking together, moving deeper into the garage toward the area where vehicles were parked. The footage shows them side by side. At times, they appear to be talking. Nothing about the moment immediately suggests that anything is wrong. Then, the two move behind one of the large concrete support pillars inside the garage. For a brief moment, they disappear from the camera's view. The surveillance camera continues recording. Seconds pass. Then more time. But when someone finally steps back into the camera's view, only one person emerges, Enrique Orochi. Christina Morris never reappears. Investigators would later analyze this footage repeatedly, trying to understand exactly what happened during those unseen moments behind the concrete pillar. But one thing was already clear. That security footage captured the final confirmed moment Christina Morris was ever seen alive. Hours passed. Morning arrived, and Christina never made it home. At first, the silence was confusing. Friends began trying to reach her. Calls were placed. Text messages were sent. But there was no response. Her phone, which had always been a reliable way to reach her, suddenly went quiet. As more time passed, concern quickly began to grow. This was not typical behavior for Christina. Friends knew that when she went out at night, she usually checked in when she arrived home safely, but that message never came. Soon, the worry reached Christina's family. Her mother began searching for answers. When no one could locate Christina and her phone remained unreachable, a missing person report was filed with local authorities.
I'm trying to report a missing person from my daughter. She hasn't shown up from work. I'm just finding out about this. Everybody's freaking out.
Police in Plano began the early stages of a missing person investigation. Officers started retracing Christina's last known movements from the night before. They searched the parking garages near the shops at Legacy. They looked through surrounding streets. They spoke with employees and patrons from the bars and restaurants in the area. At the same time, news of the disappearance began spreading through local media.
A young woman's disappearance from a Plano shopping center brought hundreds of people to Plano to learn how to protect themselves. 23-year-old Christina Morris has not been seen since August 30th. When
the story quickly caught the attention of the community. Friends, volunteers, and concerned residents began organizing search efforts, hoping to find any sign of Christina. Flyers with her photograph appeared across the area. Search teams walked fields, parking lots, and nearby neighborhoods. Everyone was hoping for the same outcome, that Christina would simply be found safe.
Both Christina and Enrique had attended Allen High School in Texas years earlier, and investigators confirmed they had known each other for some time. Because he was the last person seen with Christina, detectives quickly arranged to speak with him.
Walked over to where your vehicles were parked, is that right?
We walked separate ways. We walked until the end of the apartment complex, and after that we just split up.
During the early stages of the investigation, Orochi agreed to talk with police. He explained that after leaving the bar that night, he and Christina walked together into the parking garage. According to his account, the two eventually went their separate ways. Orochi told investigators that Christina left in another direction and that he did not know what happened to her after that. At first, his story seemed straightforward. He appeared cooperative during questioning, and at that point in the investigation, detectives were still dealing with many unknowns. There was no body, no witnesses had reported seeing an attack, and no clear evidence of a crime. But as investigators continued reviewing the timeline from that night, they began noticing something unusual. Details in Orochi's story did not always stay the same. Certain parts of his timeline began to shift. Small inconsistencies started appearing between what he told investigators and what the evidence suggested. Then detectives went back to the surveillance footage from the parking garage. They examined it more closely, frame by frame. And what they noticed next would raise even more questions about what really happened during those unseen moments inside the garage.
They realized that the key to understanding what happened that night might already be captured on camera. But it wasn't obvious at first. Investigators began examining the footage again, this time frame by frame. What had once looked like a routine walk through a parking structure now demanded much closer attention. The camera angle was limited. Large concrete pillars blocked parts of the scene, and several moments unfolded outside the camera's direct view. But as analysts slowed the footage down, they began to notice something unusual. At one point, after Christina Morris disappears behind one of the concrete pillars, the footage appears to show Enrique Orochi moving across the garage in a way that investigators found suspicious. His movements suggest he may be pulling or dragging something across the ground. From the camera's distance and angle, it was impossible to see exactly what that object was, but investigators believed it could be something heavy, possibly even the body of Christina Morris. Even so, the footage alone did not provide a complete picture. The camera's view was partially obstructed, and the exact details of what happened behind the pillar remained unclear. Investigators needed more than just surveillance video. They needed physical evidence, and that evidence would soon come from a vehicle connected to Enrique Orochi, a silver Chevrolet Camaro. Detectives obtained a warrant and conducted a forensic search of the car. Inside the vehicle, investigators discovered something critical: traces of Christina Morris's DNA. In addition to the DNA evidence, forensic analysts also found fibers that were consistent with clothing Christina had been wearing the night she disappeared. The discoveries marked a turning point in the investigation. For the first time, detectives had physical evidence linking Christina Morris to Orochi's vehicle. What had begun as a missing persons case was now beginning to look very different. The investigation had just entered a new phase, and the evidence was starting to tell a far more disturbing story about what may have happened inside that parking garage.
Now, investigators were beginning to look more closely at his behavior in the days that followed. Detectives began reviewing Orochi's actions after the night Christina vanished. They examined where he went, who he spoke to, and what he did in the hours and days that followed. Some of those actions raised new questions. Investigators learned that Orochi had taken steps to clean his vehicle shortly after Christina disappeared. To detectives, that detail stood out, because by that point, Christina was already being reported as missing. At the same time, investigators began comparing Orochi's statements with the evidence they had collected, and what they found was troubling. The details in his story didn't always stay the same.
You guys parked there in my car and she went her way. That's all I can tell you. I don't really pay attention to where people go usually.
During multiple interviews, investigators said Orochi changed parts of his account about what happened that night. In some versions of the story, he described walking with Christina for only a short distance.
In other accounts, the timeline shifted. Certain details about where they walked inside the garage also changed. Detectives noticed that the more questions they asked, the more the story seemed to evolve. Small differences began appearing between his explanations and what the surveillance footage suggested. Those inconsistencies began to add up. Investigators now had surveillance video placing Orochi with Christina inside the parking garage. They had forensic evidence connecting her to his vehicle, and they had a timeline that investigators believed did not match the explanation he had given. As detectives continued reconstructing the events of that night, they began forming a disturbing theory. Christina Morris may never have left that parking garage alive. The investigation was no longer centered on a missing person. Now, detectives believed they might be dealing with something far more serious. As investigators continued building their case, the evidence surrounding the disappearance of Christina Morris began to accumulate. Piece by piece, detectives worked to reconstruct what they believed had happened inside the parking garage that night. One of the most important discoveries came from the forensic examination of Enrique Orochi's vehicle. Inside the trunk of his silver Chevrolet Camaro, investigators found traces of Christina Morris's DNA. Forensic specialists also identified fibers in the vehicle that were consistent with clothing Christina had been wearing on the night she disappeared. For detectives, those findings carried significant weight. They suggested that Christina had been inside the vehicle at some point after she entered the parking garage. At the same time, investigators continued analyzing the surveillance footage from the area. The cameras showed Christina walking into the garage with Orochi, but when the footage later captured someone leaving the structure, only one person appeared on camera, Orochi. Christina never returned to view. Investigators also examined cell phone data connected to the case. By studying phone activity and location information, detectives worked to piece together movements and timelines from that night. Each new detail helped investigators strengthen their understanding of what had likely happened. But even as the evidence grew stronger, there was still one major problem. Christina Morris was still missing. Search efforts had stretched across fields, roads, and surrounding areas, but investigators had not yet located her body. Without that discovery, proving exactly what had happened would be much more difficult. Prosecutors would need to rely heavily on forensic evidence, digital records, and the timeline investigators had carefully reconstructed. The case was beginning to take shape, but one crucial piece of the puzzle was still missing. And until Christina Morris was found, the investigation remained incomplete.
It's been 2 years since Christina Morris vanished from a Plano parking garage. She was caught on surveillance video. That was the last time she was seen. Plano police believe she was abducted and murdered.
After years of investigation, searches, and mounting evidence, the case surrounding the death of Christina Morris finally moved into the courtroom. In 2018, the trial of Enrique Orochi began in Collin County, Texas. Prosecutors presented their case by carefully walking the jury through the events of the night Christina disappeared. According to investigators, Christina Morris entered the parking garage at the shops at Legacy alongside Orochi in the early morning hours of August 30th, 2014. Prosecutors argued that somewhere inside that garage, an attack took place. They told the jury that Orochi then transported Christina's body in his vehicle. Investigators believed he later disposed of her remains in a remote area of North Texas. Throughout the trial, prosecutors relied heavily on the timeline investigators had reconstructed. They pointed to surveillance footage that showed Christina entering the garage with Orochi. They presented forensic evidence recovered from his vehicle, including traces of Christina's DNA. And they highlighted the inconsistencies investigators had found in Orochi's statements during the investigation. But the defense challenged the prosecution's conclusions. Defense attorneys argued that there were no eyewitnesses to a crime. They pointed out that much of the case relied on circumstantial evidence. Without a direct witness or a recorded moment of violence, they suggested that investigators had drawn conclusions that were not proven beyond doubt. For the jury, the case required careful examination of every detail. They reviewed the forensic evidence, the surveillance footage, the timeline constructed by investigators, and the testimony presented during the trial. After considering the evidence, the jury reached its decision. In 2018, Enrique Arochi was found guilty of the murder of Christina Morris. The court sentenced him to life in prison. Enrique still refused to admit what he did with Christina's body. He claimed he had nothing to do with her disappearance. Though the body wasn't found, all evidence still pointed to the fact that Enrique was the guilty person. As for Christina's family, the verdict brought a measure of justice after years of uncertainty and loss. But even with the conviction, one question still lingered. Why? What exactly led to the events that unfolded inside that parking garage on that August night? Some details of the motive remain unclear, but the evidence presented during the trial was enough for the jury to determine responsibility. And with that verdict, the long search for justice in the case of Christina Morris reached its legal conclusion.
For years after Christina Morris disappeared, the search for answers continued. Investigators followed leads. Volunteers searched fields and remote areas across North Texas. Her family held on to the hope that one day they would finally learn what had happened. But as months turned into years, that answer remained painfully out of reach. Then, nearly 4 years after Christina vanished, a discovery would finally bring investigators closer to the truth. In March of 2018, human remains were found in a rural area near the city of Anna, Texas, north of Plano. Authorities were called to the scene. The remains were carefully recovered and sent for forensic examination. For investigators who had spent years working on the case, the moment carried enormous weight. The next step would determine whether this discovery was connected to the disappearance that had haunted the community for so long. Forensic testing was conducted, and eventually the results confirmed what Christina's family had feared. The remains belonged to Christina Morris. After nearly 4 years of uncertainty, the mystery surrounding her disappearance had finally reached a devastating conclusion. For investigators, the discovery confirmed the outcome they had long suspected. But for Christina's family, the moment brought a different kind of reality. The years of searching and waiting had ended, and the truth, when it finally arrived, carried a heartbreak that could never be undone. After the verdict was delivered and the courtroom proceedings came to an end, the story of Christina Morris did not simply disappear from public memory. Even though her remains had been found, no additional charges were filed against Enrique. One legal expert explained that in order to pursue a capital murder conviction, prosecutors would have needed to prove an additional separate kidnapping charge tied directly to the homicide. But bringing a new capital case was considered unlikely. Enrique had already been tried and convicted for kidnapping, and under the principle of double jeopardy, a person cannot be prosecuted twice for the same offense. He is already serving a life sentence. For her family, the years that followed were about something different, remembering who Christina was and honoring the life that was taken from them. Throughout the investigation and the long search for answers, Christina's family had spoken publicly many times. They thanked the volunteers who joined search efforts across North Texas. Hundreds of people had walked through fields, wooded areas, and neighborhoods hoping to find some clue that might bring Christina home. For her family, those volunteers represented the kindness of strangers who refused to let the case be forgotten. The investigation itself also left a lasting impact on the community. For many people in North Texas, the case changed the way they thought about everyday situations that once felt routine. Parking garages, late nights out, the short walk back to a car after leaving a bar or restaurant. Places that once felt ordinary suddenly carried a different meaning. Over time, the disappearance and murder of Christina Morris became one of the most widely followed criminal cases in the region. The story received extensive media attention and drew national interest as investigators worked to uncover what had happened that night. But beyond the headlines and courtroom proceedings, the case remains, above all, a reminder of a life that was lost. A daughter, a friend, a young woman whose future ended far too soon. For Christina Morris, what began as a normal night out with friends ended inside a parking garage where she would never be seen again. And even years later, one haunting question still lingers in the minds of many who followed the case. What truly happened during those unseen minutes behind that concrete pillar?